Hey, Blue Table fans. I am going to talk to you about DM tactics and techniques. First off, DM versus GM. Dungeon Master is Dungeons and Dragons. GM, Game Master, is all those other games. And because I'm old school and played first edition Dungeons and Dragons in the super early 80s at age of 12, I usually use the term DM because that brings back all those good memories. So here's one thing you can do. Here's step one. Buy this figure. This is a Landshark, which is a classic D&D original type monster. And there's tons of ecology of and background articles for this animal. They're really cool. They're super scary for a very low level of adventure. A party of first or second level adventurers can be TPK'd, total party killed, by one of these creatures. So what you do is you set it up where for a while the party feels rumbling and they don't know where it's coming from, and just do it for a session or maybe even multiple sessions, and just make it no big deal. They hear there's like a rumbling sensation. And they'll look around and be like, is there an earthquake? Is the ceiling collapsing? Whatever it is, but of course this is the Landshark, the bullet, I think is how you say it. It's scouting them out. It's hunting them. And make it get closer. Finally they figure out it's coming from underneath the ground. And it could be a lot of monsters. They won't necessarily know that it's a Landshark. And then what you do is one session, as they are just trundling on home, maybe out in the outdoors, you have them sit there and be like, I need you to set up your models. And then and you have some other minor encounter, like they're talking to a traveling merchant, or they have just driven off some bad guys and they're rescuing some peasants from the trees, or any number of things. So you have a reason to have the encounter, and then you start playing. Put on the theme from Jaws, and it is great. It's about 3 minutes, and then they'll just be like, what? And then you hear the rumbling. It's closer than it's ever been. And then what you do is you take that miniature and you slap it down right next to one of the party members as the Landshark bursts out of the ground. And let me tell you, you will get at least one person to jump out of their seat. All right, on to the second one. As a general rule, when I approach role-playing, I view it as a shared fantasy. So I go on to some boards or Facebook groups, and you hear the person saying, oh, my player wants to do this, but, and they just want backup so they can squash the creativity of this other human. Or sometimes in the name of game balance. But as a DM, you're hosting their fantasies. And if it's their fantasy, it's a fantasy role-playing game, really, these things should be indulged. But let's back up a minute. The real thing that people miss is they kind of throw a group together and they never talk about what kind of fantasy does this group want to have. So start with that. Start with sending out a campaign guide. Usually my campaign guide says that alignments in a group have to be compatible with whatever it is, like good alignments only, or compatible with lawful good. Or sometimes I'll say we're going to have a cooperative, low fantasy, Lord of the Rings type situation. And I'll say loner, berserker, antisocials will not work in this game. Those are the bad guys. And so just make sure you're ready for this fantasy. And your group might not want that. The usual complaint is murder hobos, which is that traveling adventurers just kill the townsfolk, and they're like act in a villainous sort of way. But guess what? That's a fantasy too. Why have this fantasy? It's okay, if you had $30 million in the bank, would you play Dungeons and Dragons? Maybe. I know I would. I would have the best Dungeons and Dragons game ever. However, for the majority of humans, no, you would go out and actually experience life. And so D&D it's meant to be an escape from reality. Well, if you're like, well, you got to keep the rules and the town guard are going to show up and execute you. Well, you know, maybe that's not the fantasy that your players want to have. Like going into a realistic situation isn't necessarily the best for a fantasy role-playing game. It's like, hey, we're playing a fantasy role-playing game. Who are you going to be? Ooh, I want to be a half-water elemental where I can change into water shapes. And I have a blue flying cat as my pet. No, you can't have any of that. Oh, that's stupid. Well, you kind of well, you said this is a world where you could do or be anything. Your imagination's the limit. It's like, yeah, well, you can't do that. And I think that as a general rule, go with what your players want to do. Let them play a character that they're excited about. All right, so here are just a couple of things that you can do to make your game more interesting. With the advent of Pathfinder, and I believe 4th edition, Dungeons & Dragons became more of a board game where the Dungeon Master had what's called a challenge rating, where the monsters were given like numbers of how hard they were, and you're supposed to scale that according to the party level. So people playing the game, they know this, and in Pathfinder, it's in the core rulebook. The Dungeon Master, here's the experience points of the monsters, here's how much treasure they usually give out. So the players are expecting these encounters to be constructed in this certain way, which creates a problem because the Dungeon Master now has constraints. His almighty powers are constrained. And if you're in that situation where the players try and view things as fair, you can make encounters more interesting by doing different types of things that will make them challenging, but not necessarily make the monsters more powerful. And as a side note to that, you shouldn't take away things that the party gets. So if they get too powerful, and they also want you to work within constraints, well, you're going to have to get imaginative. So, technique number 1 is called the puppy. Oh man, I love this one. The party simply encounters a puppy by the road. Maybe it's abandoned or tied up or leg is in a trap. Now, puppy could be anything. It could be a fox. It could be the flying cat the player wanted. It could be actually a human, maybe a villager. And that villager becomes engages in a little hero worship. He or she can't get enough of one of the party members, thinks they're like the greatest thing. Whatever you do, just role play this creature to get it into the group. And don't jump into this horrible aspect, which I'm about to describe. Long story short, the puppy is a tag-along, and hopefully you can get it to where the party won't get rid of it, or him, or her. But the thing is, the puppy barks at inopportune moments, gives away their position, might wander off, or create some sort of drama. And so the party, when they are actually having an encounter, they have this being that they have to take extraordinary measures for to keep them out of harm's way. Like in comic books, the dependent non-player character of the hero games system, where, like the Aunt May, she gets kidnapped. She shows up at the bank while it's being robbed. Or whoever it is, the Lois Lane, she falls off the building, and now Superman he's fighting this guy, and now he's got to somehow do something about Lois Lane. And that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing with the puppy. And you haven't made the game like technically harder, but boy, have you made it harder. Here's the next technique. It's called the choke point, which is basically you create like terrain of the encounter isn't considered part of the challenge rating system. That's just the monsters. So the choke point could be a rope bridge, or it could be a teleportation device where only one person can cross at a time. So the first person teleports over, they're alone in the encounter. And then the next round, the next person shows up. Next person. So basically you're sort of filtering them in. So those are my two techniques. And the choke point could also be rough terrain. Or you could create a situation where, again, this is a variation of both, the puppy and the choke point. Like you can have some villagers who are up in a tree and the orcs have lit the tree on fire. So now they've got to sort of deal with this other situation. So whatever you can do to sort of break the party up and make the encounter more interesting. It makes the world more vibrant and also challenges your players. I'm going to do a third one. The third technique is the flunky. So with the flunky, you simply you take some of that budget you have with experience points or challenge rating or whatever, and you just carve off a little bit of it. This is great in higher levels, by the way. So where the encounter might be 10,000 experience points. Well, take 1,000 of that, a tenth, to put in 10 lowly orcs. And just have them run around, be distractions. Like each one of them can throw their lives away to just give the main guy +2 to his hit roll because now he's flanking because the flunky came up. So the party has to somehow deal with these flunkies. And if they don't, the flunkies will obstruct line of sight, they'll block charge lanes, and they will just be a nuisance. They'll run off into another encounter area, which is another type of technique. You got to be careful with this one because you get pretty unfair pretty fast, but also put the burden on the players, which is if there's 4 encounter areas done to the exact level they're supposed to be, which is not very challenging, by the way, but you make it where all of them can just hear the first combat and come running in 1 round, 2 rounds, 4 rounds, then the party's really got a challenge on their hand. And that's a way to challenge them as well. And also create great tactical and role-playing situations where they had better go into this orc lair carefully. Or they're going to alert, all of a sudden everybody's going to be piling on. Or that one of them, he tries to go sound the alarm. So one guy's like running away. Somehow they got to not only deal with the encounter, but they got to keep that other guy, keep the scout from escaping. So flunkies are great. If you get them to blow up an action, and it's action economy too. If you get them to get the wizard to blow up an action to just fireball all those flunkies, well, guess what? He blew up an action. He blew up a spell slot. And that's how you get things to be more challenging. And then the last thing I would say is play better. As DM, it's one brain against 4, 5, 6 other brains. They only have their one character control. You got to pay attention to everything. Well, guess what? If you get better at it and you know the rules and do your homework and learn about their feats, oh, they have power attack. Oh, they have pounce. They have group tactics that give them bonus on their hit rolls. Oh, they have an aura that gives penalties to things around them. Just all those little things, you can just track them better. You can create a more challenging experience for your players. All right, that's all I got to say. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.